Good morning, everybody, and you're welcome to Fórum Uisce's second webinar, this one on the theme of peatlands. Our webinar is based on a research undertaking which we commissioned in the past 12 months on the Irish peatlands, with particular reference to the scope of Fórum Uisce, which is about water quality and the role which peatlands and which protection of peatlands can make, not simply to supporting water quality issues, but also to the wider environmental question. It seems to me Ireland has always had an ambivalent relationship to its peatlands. Spent many years working in Maynooth, and where we used to tell our students that the castle in Maynooth was built there by the Fitzgeralds to protect the Pale from what would come at them from the bogs and the woodlands of Laois and Offaly. And ever since, I think, urban dwellers look at peatlands with a certain level of trepidation. It is only relatively recently, I think, that we have realized that peatlands were basically our rainforests. They're rainforests under the earth. Their capacity around carbon management, their capacity for cleaning water, their capacity for water storage, for flood management, have only now been, I think, come into focus. So this is part of the background to which our research addressed and part of the rationale for this webinar. To open the webinar, I am delighted to welcome Minister Noonan. Minister Noonan is TD representing Carlow-Kilkenny constituency and was appointed Minister of State for Heritage and Electoral Reform in July 2020. He has a background prior to entering the electoral politics in environmental and community activism, was Director and National Coordinator with Friends of the Earth Ireland, with a long involvement in community activism, in activism around biodiversity, climate action and related areas. The Minister has a primary degree in rural development and is working on his Master's on International Development at my old alma mater in Maynooth. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Minister, and I'll hand it to you and thank you for giving your time to open our webinar today.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. And first of all, I just want to thank Tom as Chair of Fórum Uisce and the members of the Forum for commissioning this really important piece of research which you're going to be focusing on here this morning. The Water Forum in Fórum Uisce was set up in accordance with the Water Services Act of 2017 to provide a platform for public engagement relating to water as an environmental, social and economic resource, and in the role of out of our River Basin Management Plan, the third cycle of which will be published shortly. To ensure that the Forum's recommendations on key issues and topics of concern are based on sound science and the best available evidence, the Forum commissions research into areas impacting on water quality. Today's webinar provides an opportunity for us to hear presentations on the research commission on the management of peatlands to optimise water quality returns, while also delivering for biodiversity and climate mitigation. It provides us with an opportunity to engage in a wider stakeholder network to further inform the Forum's position and subsequent policy recommendations. And as you heard in the Chair's introduction, again, it's around realigning and rewiring our relationship with peatlands into the future. Today's discussion is timely, occurring as it does during National Biodiversity Week, that we focus on actions to protect biodiversity and water quality, as well as mitigate climate impacts. And yesterday I had the great privilege of being up in Wicklow Mountains National Park, where we launched a really innovative collaborative project with Intel Ireland around the rewetting of 60 hectares of upland bogs in the Liffey headwater, which will deliver multiple benefits for soil, for carbon, for water and for biodiversity. So it's the first of its kind to partner in with business on that scale. So we're really looking forward to the outputs of that. Functioning peatlands capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the form of peat and vegetation. They form the headwaters of many of our important river systems in Ireland and provide for a variety of ecosystem services, from biodiversity to clean water and reduce carbon emissions. They are vital for flood management and can mitigate flooding in downstream towns and villages. They provide a home for many of our endangered species and hold a rich place in our heritage, being important places of work, recreation and natural beauty. Many of us will have a significant memory of trips to the bog to cut, foot and bag the turf harvest for our families' supply of fuel for the winter. Increasing pressure from drainage associated with intensified agriculture, turf cutting, afforestation and fire, however, has rendered 95% of our 1.5 million hectares of peatland in very poor condition, contributing an estimated 6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions per year. Drained peatlands negatively impact the quality of nearby surface waters by releasing nutrients, heavy metals and fluvial carbon. This has had the effect of degrading stream and downstream river habitats as silt and organic matter clog up habitats, impacting on invertebrates and fish and resulting in severe biodiversity loss and damage. Over the years, land use policies relating to peatlands have varied considerably. These have ranged from active planting of commercial coniferous forestry, large-scale commercial cutting and burning of peat to increased stock levels and the decreasing stocking rates. Many of these policies were born out of social and economic needs as we saw them at the time. Despite a range of approaches to reduce and mitigate the impacts of on peatlands and restore them, we have not yet achieved a halt in the decline on the quality of our environment. Although today similar social and economic pressures still persist, we are now being overshadowed by the dual global crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ireland was one of the first countries in the world to declare a global biodiversity and climate emergency in 2019. Numerous government and EU-funded restoration projects are underway to halt and reverse the loss of peatland through sustainable management, rehabilitation and restoration. We will hear from some of these projects later today. I am greatly encouraged by Bord na Móna's substantial move into bog restoration and by the successful collaboration between farming and environment in the Pearl Mussel project operated by my colleague, the Minister for Agriculture, and the startup of the Wild Atlantic Nature Life Programme. Local communities and farmers are central to conservation and restoration efforts. It is vital that we listen to communities and ensure that any decision around peatland management works for them. And this is the principle of the just transition. This is about nature and people. We've also more recently signed up to the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. We have really strong targets to meet in the EU biodiversity strategy, 30% land, 30% marine and 10% strict protection, and with really eye-watering restoration targets as well. But we have a myriad of projects underway, and that many of which we will learn from and hear about here this morning. We have brought to government the prioritised action framework for nature, over 1.3 billion over a seven-year period, and this will give an opportunity to target and to leverage funding from further life programmes and EIPs, and these will play a significant role in that regard. Delivering on results-based schemes through high nature value farming approaches. So the pace of change has been remarkable, a story that we think could inspire other countries to move rapidly from brown to green. So I think we should inspire other countries and other communities by showing how our centuries-old relationship with our bogs and our peatlands can have a new chapter now, based on renewal and a shared sustainable future. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you here this morning to listen to some of the outputs of the work, and again to congratulate and commend the An Fórum Uisce for putting in this piece of research, because I think it's vitally important to inform our science-based solutions towards our common goals. Go raibh maith agat.
Go raibh maith agat, Ara. Thank you, Minister, for those observations. They set the scene beautifully for our event this morning. Just before introducing our first speaker, just to remind, first of all, I should welcome the many people we have here. That we have attendees from a very wide range of voluntary and non-statutory groups. We have a wide range of departmental and other representatives also with us. So So to welcome you all, and just to remind you that should you have questions, please post them on live stream, and there will also be an opportunity to respond to a poll at the break. So we will go immediately then into the presentations on the research, and the lead research, the lead member of the team was Florence Renou-Wilson. Florence is a member of the School of Biology and Environmental Science in UCD, has been working on peatlands for more than 20 years at the crossroads of ecology, forestry, agriculture, climate change, and sustainable management. She is also now the scientific advisor to the government's multi-stakeholder Peatlands Council. And Florence will talk on an introduction to peatlands, natural, degraded, and rewetted. So I'm delighted to welcome you here, Florence. Thank you for your work, and I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, Minister. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this webinar this morning and to see so many people interested in peatlands. So as you said, Tom, together with my colleagues, we have carried out a state-of-the-art review of Irish peatlands and their current status and the services they provide and what happens when they are utilized. This report came at the right time. There is currently in Ireland and indeed elsewhere in the world, a shift in social values towards peatlands, from unsustainable use of peat to managing them for their environmental, socio-cultural services for the greater good. So during this morning's webinar, and with the help of other peatland professionals, we hope to unpack the key message in this report, which was healthy peatlands are essential for human well-being, for storing and sequestering more carbon, for improving water quality, for providing a habitat for wildlife and a place for people to connect with nature. So I think we have to act together to reimagine peatland management. And this morning, I'll just start with a brief introduction to our peatlands and what we need to understand, and then we will have inputs from all the other members. So it's been recognized around the world now that peatlands have suffered from what we call the Cinderella syndrome, often seen as wasteland and only good to put next to the hearth for burning. But we have now recognized that peatlands are quite extraordinary ecosystems. Because natural peatlands are wet, dead material doesn't decompose. And of course, this is why peat accumulates at a very, very slow rate of 1 millimeter per year. So if you take a look down at this peat profile you have here, just about 20 centimeters down, the peat you see is made of dead plants and animals that lived during the Great Irish Famine. 50 centimeters down, that's when Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Down 1.2 meters, and you see the plants that grew when the Vikings raided Ireland. And if you all go down all the way to the bottom, to the many meters, to see this, what we call marl, but it's not only marl, you can have glacial clay. This is what lived 10,000 years ago, and these were lakes, obviously. These were lakes that formed after the ice retreated, and that's where all it started. In fact, the whole of Irish history, natural and human, is buried in our bogs. Each layer of peat is telling us what the climate was, what plants or trees were growing around them, what hairstyle people had back then, the butter they ate, or that they didn't in this case. Peatlands have lived through all this past environmental and cultural change through Ireland. And in fact, they may also well hold answers to address future changes as well. So if we go back to our peat profile there, just to give you a few clues on what our peat is made of, because there's, as you can see, there's different types of peat. Fen peat at the very bottom is our oldest types of peat, and you can still find the reeds that grew there and didn't decompose. And due to the continuous wet and cold weather over millennia, fen found themselves above the influence of surrounding water table and started to accumulate a different kind of peat. And that was mostly sphagnum peat or moss peat that grew in the shape of a raised dome. But now that the peat has been either industrially extracted, you can actually see again on the other side of the dome, but you can see again those fen peat that used to be buried there. So when you look at a bog, you really need to understand that what you see could be a different peat types, and this is very important to understand. So these are fens that turn into raised bogs, but in the west and in higher altitudes, where the western seaboard and higher altitude, there's a combination of wetter climate and unfavorable geology and human interference allowed peat to accumulate like a blanket over those washed out mineral soils, or sometimes directly over the rocks. This is actually known as solidification or wetting of the soil. And blanket bogs are by far the most widespread types of peatland we have in Ireland. And we have the lowland types that spread from the Atlantic shore across extensive areas of flat ground. And if you go above 150 meters at this elevation, you have a colder climate. And we have the mountain blanket bog, which form very unique types of landscape, like you see here in Donegal, with irregular hydrology and mosaic of habitats. And just the little note there that bog is actually come from the Gaelic boga, which means soft, and it's an internationally accepted term for non-brotrophic peatlands, referring to those very special bogs, peatlands that have that receive only water and nutrients from rainfall, basically. So Irish peatlands are also rather special on the global peatland scene, and not only for their variety, but also for their sheer proportion. They cover a fifth of the land, 20%. And although you can find peat in most countries in the world, very few countries share such a high percentage, especially when you realize that globally peat covers just less than 3% of the entire global land surface. So from Fannet Head to Loop Head and from Clare Island to Glendalough, each peatland is a unique combination of microhabitats and associated species. Therefore, they are hotspots of biodiversity. And I could tell you a lot about those amazing properties, amazing plants and their properties, such as the water-holding antiseptic sphagnum, the carnivorous drosera that hides amongst them, the bog cotton sedges that breathe underwater thanks to a Malteser-like structure, the bog bean, a famous folk medicine up here in Donegal. But I will actually let Tina show you even some of her amazing illustrations of what bog wildlife looks like. So I just want you to remember now is by hotspot, I don't mean there are many species. By hotspot, I mean there are few rare species that have evolved to survive in this harsh environment. And these species are important because they cannot survive anywhere else. They can't be found in grassland, in cropland, in forests, because it's too dry, too rich, too competitive there. These plants can only survive in the poor water that is found in the bogs. So when we drain our bogs, when we change the land use, these plants have nowhere else to go because nitrogen mostly is now present in all our waters and all our land elsewhere. So this is important to understand. For the plants to survive and for the peat to accumulate, for a bog to be alive, it must be wet and with the right kind of rainfall, the Irish rainfall. Intact peatlands not only hold enormous amount of water, but it filters it, it regulates its flow. So water is the very life of the bog. And understanding this is perhaps the most critical point for their management. Each bog has its own complex hydrology, its chemistry, and more critically, it is very susceptible to any land use changes. So whatever you decide to do with that bog, it will first and foremost affect the water. I use this typical peatland landscape here in County Mayo as a schematic to map out Irish peatland land use cover in this country. So if we look at the middle there, Shishkin Moor Reserves actually represents here the proportion of bogs we have in this country that have a conservation value, and we only have 18% of that. Conversely, that means we have 82% of our bogs that have been drained to some extent, be it for agriculture, forestry, turf cutting, industrial pit extraction, wind farms, infrastructure even. Drainage has transformed the Irish peatlands in so many visible, but so many invisible ways as well. To view it differently, this pie chart shows you the real face of our peatlands in the 21st century in Ireland. And this face, why is there a problem with this face? Because we know that land use change has impacted on the peatland properties, the peat soil properties. And in turn, these will have effect on the biogeochemistry of the soil, the water, and the air. So of interest here, I want to point to the fact that having a third roughly of peatlands under agriculture, a third under forestry, the next biggest land use is domestic cutover. Industrial cutaway is a small proportion actually of our peatland resource, but it has affected mostly our raised bogs. And I want to briefly point to the fact that out of our original raised bog, only 16% of that remains uncut, okay? But more worryingly, only 1% is in healthy condition. Only 1% of our raised bogs is alive. There are more green parks in Dublin city centre than there's peat-forming raised bogs left in the entire country. Meanwhile, of course, cutover has affected old bogs, including blanket bogs, and the blanket bogs have also suffered. They may not have been industrially extracted, but they have themselves been the focus of other land use change, such as afforestation, grazing, burning, and wind farm. So what I want to say here is that Ireland is hanging onto its natural peatland by the skin of its teeth, really. And natural peatlands, we need to understand, they provide a host of ecosystem functions, which in turn provide so many services and benefits, which really benefit the environment and the society. When peat is extracted, while it provides economic and socio-cultural services of its own, these are not sustainable and they are not compatible with the other benefits, which it cancels out all the other benefits provided by a healthy, uncut bog. But even if the peatlands are simply drained, okay, and even if they're not cut, drained peatlands, say for grassland or forestry, many of the services are also reversed, and these services are produced when we drain our bogs, including biodiversity loss, land degradation, peat shrinkage and wastage, increased fires, release of greenhouse gas emissions, and David will expand on this later on. I want to focus on the water issue a little bit here, because peatland drainage, regardless of the land use, has serious knock-on effects on our waterways, as the minister has mentioned. Drained peatlands degrade the quality of nearby surface waters by releasing nutrients, especially ammonium, but also carbon, heavy metals, and this adds pressure to the water body downstream, including those in the sensitive catchment areas. It reduces the water quality, which impacts on aquatic organisms downstream, and creating financial and health implications for the water treatment industry. But there is some good news, because water itself is also the key to our degraded problems. Water, the blood of the bog, can be managed, and the bog can be rewetted in order to reverse these negative impacts. Rewetting is defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a deliberate action of raising the water table on drained soils. So you do that by blocking drainage ditches, by disabling pump facilities, reprofiling surface slope water. In short, basically, you manage the water table so that it remains close to the surface, not above and not fluctuating. This is not the same as rehabilitation, as Bornemona has been carried out until recently. It is not lake creation. It is a basic house plumbing, no flooding. Rewetting requires serious monitoring and management of the water table so that it is close to the surface, not above. And the definition we have of a wet organic soil is where you have the water table between 0 and minus 30 centimeters below the surface. So we have a bit of room here. And rewetting can have several objectives. It often is the first step towards restoration, but rewetting of peat soils can happen under existing land use categories, be it grassland, forestry, and they can be managed this way to keep the carbon locked in the soil. Severely degraded bogs can even be rewetted and combined with what we call wet farming, for example, using water-loving plants, such as sphagnum. This is known as paludiculture or wet farming. So remember that term, paludification, that happened millennia ago. We can do that again which will help not only protecting carbon store, but a whole lot of other services. So restoration and rewetting are the two main actions we need to focus on. Now, remember, peatland restoration aims at permanently reestablish the ecosystem that existed before disturbance. So the bog in all its glory that accumulated over millennia. So let's be clear. Restoration is only possible where degradation has been minimum or very localized, okay? So restoration alone is not sufficient to manage our peatlands. These are very few protected at the moment, mostly in the protected network. Right now, rewetting degraded peat soils is our main goal to successfully combat the three foes we have, which is biodiversity loss, water pollution, and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions. Now, of course, we must start with public-owned peatlands, but this is not just for the big peatland owners such as Cuitia and Bornemona. It's not just for our network of protected peatlands. Everybody's peatlands, all the peatlands are significant, and how you manage those peat soils is critical. And this needs to be communicated to all peatland owners and the communities who have an interest in passing on their natural heritage to the next generation. I suppose this is called cathedral thinking. We know this is a right time to think that way because the evidence is in the increasing membership of the Community Wetlands Forum, for example, and community-led project that looked after their bogs. And no matter how small there is, this is a little drumming bog in Hello, Minister. These are very important bogs looked after by their communities, and they're all important. Chris will give you a direct experience of this phenomenon, but this is the right time for everybody to take action. Already the farming communities have responded to this call to manage our peatlands with successful locally led European innovation partnership, EIP projects, such as the freshwater permosol, the hen harrier projects. Farmers have rewetted their bogs or have managed their access to the bogs by cattle, for example, to allow for other benefits such as improved water quality. So we also have two new EIP projects that have just started to finding better ways to manage on-farm peat soils. And these two EIPs, unfortunately, are confined to the Midlands. Now, remember the map of Ireland, Minister? 70% of our bogs are blanket bogs, and they are in the west of Ireland mostly. So it's time to look to the west, where employment for farmers, communities-led activities, and ecotourism could be brought together around those bogs. And you will hear Derek talk about the Wild Atlantic Nature Life project later on. In order to be a good ancestor, we need a new model to reimagine peatland management. And as a society, we have to decide how we want to manage our peatland heritage, which is currently harming us because of the way we utilize them. There is no panacea, but we can build a toolbox for all peatland stakeholders. And in this report, we have identified 4 priorities we should be pursued in order to build this toolbox. And of course, the first priority is to start with the stakeholders themselves, the landowners, the community groups, because peatland and people have been closely connected by a long history of cultural and economic development. And they should be part of the future life of the bog again. And Kate will expand on the first priority later on, why we should include social values in our peatland management. And this is obviously the first priority. I want to expand on the other 3 priorities very quickly now by just saying what we need really. What we need first is for all peatland stakeholders to recognize the impact, be it negative, positive, or even synergistic, of each decision, each management options, because each decision, each management option has an impact on climate, biodiversity, water, and sociocultural services. So we have put in the report a schematic that I would like all the stakeholders to look at and to remember and to share and to communicate to everybody else so that they're aware of the risks and the benefits. Second, what we need is actions from the politicians. Continuing business as usual is at odds with all other environmental legislations that Ireland is allegedly trying to achieve. Okay. For example, within the EU LULUCF, the EU Land Use and Land Use Change Regulation, which has just begun its first cycle, we have Ireland is currently reporting significant emissions from the LULUCF sector. This is largely due to our management of organic soils and peatlands. This needs to be addressed in order to achieve the 2050 objectives. And there's also innovative solutions proposed in the Green Deal CAP instruments to help farmers diversify while looking after their peatlands. There's also financial options. Financing integrated sustainable peatland management should be a long-term policy, and it is critical that the government provide a long-term financial framework to secure the continuity of this management, and that's not only for the protected designated peatland. Help should come to the non-designated peatlands as well. And carbon credit schemes could provide this additional financial intervention. And these schemes can deliver not only climate change mitigations, but it support habitat conservation, provide cleaner water, and generate new sources of income for farmers and landowners. Finally, our last priority really is to combine all our knowledge. This is a time where everybody should find out information where they can about peatlands and take action at all levels, all sectors, because peatlands are found at all crossroads in Ireland. I want to specifically point out to the very important smaller projects, low intervention restoration techniques that are supported by local groups or small scale funded projects like the LowPro can be very successful in reorienting undesired trajectories of degraded bogs and contribute to the return of the beneficial services at a very local level, very efficiently. And we must better collaborate and share information to communities and all the stakeholders. This is important to have synergy across projects and to improve techniques, and to have Irish solutions to our Irish problems, basically. Ireland currently lacks such a compendium of restoration and rewetting projects in order to make all this information available to all the stakeholders. So hopefully this will be happening soon after following this report. So in summary, we have extensive peatlands, but they are mostly degraded. In fact, 82% of our Irish peatlands is degraded. Drain bogs exacerbate climate change, pollute our waterways, the air we breathe, increase risk of flooding and fires, destroy biodiversity, our historical artifacts, and our last refuge of wilderness. We must restore, but we must most importantly rewet peatlands to bring back their ecosystem services that we once had and took for granted. We all have to work and act together to reimagine peatland management in order to optimize these benefits at a local scale. And we all have to work together to make our peatlands alive again. Now, of course, there are challenges. Challenges do exist. I don't have time to discuss them all today, but let's not make the how overshadowing the why this needs to be done. Thank you for listening. And I would like to thank in particular my colleagues, Dr. Kat Chinecki, Emily Rondato, David Wilson, Kate Flood, and Connie O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Flo. What a great way to finish a presentation with the challenge of let's make our bogs alive again, which really is probably one of the yet another national challenge that we should take on with some relish. Our second speaker in this session this morning, and just to remind you all, we will have a Q&A at 11 a.m., but please put your questions and comments up on screen on the live stream through the morning. But let me now move to Dr. David Wilson, who was also a member of the research team on this piece of work. David received his doctorate in 2005 for work investigating the impact of peatland restoration on greenhouse gas emissions. He's a lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2013, Wetland Supplements, and is widely published in the peer-reviewed scientific journals, etc. David will deal with the question of carbon cycling in natural, drained and rewetted peatlands. So I'll hand it to you now, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for the very kind introduction, and to An-Forum Uisce for the invitation. And of course, good morning, everyone. For my talk today, I'd like to focus on just one aspect of the many peatland ecosystem services that Flo has just outlined, namely the carbon stored in our peatlands. In particular, I would describe how the carbon came to be there, how it is under constant pressure from land use changes, what might happen to it in the future under pressure from climate change, and how we can protect it. So, since the last ice age, peatlands have helped regulate the global climate. And if Bill Gates is listening into this webinar, they have done this by sequestering carbon, which is defined as the process of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Global peatlands store over 600 billion tons of carbon, and this value may even be an underestimate given that new peatlands are continually being discovered and refinements in data collection are ongoing. But to put this into context, the amount of carbon estimated to be stored in peatlands globally is equivalent to the amount of carbon stored in all vegetation, which includes forests, and is close to the amount of carbon stored in the atmosphere. And of course, there is a certain amount of fluidity between some of these pools, with carbon moving back and forth between the atmosphere and vegetation, although pools such as permafrost and peatlands are much more stable. So from a climate change and global warming perspective, it is in our interest to ensure that as much carbon as possible is contained in pools like permafrost and peatlands, and that the atmosphere pool does not increase further. Now for Ireland, our most recent estimates indicate that there are approximately 2.2 billion tons of carbon distributed across the various peatland land uses. So how did all this carbon come to be locked up in our peatlands? Well, typically peat accumulation tends to occur at very slow rates and can vary between years, between peatlands and even within peatlands. But over long time periods, this equates to a hell of a lot of peat. Moreover, as the carbon content in dry peat is around 50%, this also equates to a hell of a lot of carbon. And as a rough rule of thumb, 1 meter deep peat could hold around 400 or so tons of carbon per hectare, which of course increases as the peat deposit deepens. Key to the ability of a peatland to function as a carbon sink is the position of the water table. In natural peatlands, it is positioned close to the surface of the peat for much of the year. This prevents the fast decomposition of the peat, as the waterlogged conditions result in little or no oxygen being available for the soil microbes. Furthermore, the presence of sphagnum mosses on the surface increases the acidity of the peat, further suppressing peat decomposition. So plants fix carbon dioxide or CO2 from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. They release some CO2 back to the atmosphere as they respire. The remainder of that carbon is then used to make new leaves and stems and roots. Some CO2 is also released to the atmosphere as the microbes themselves decompose the most recent organic matter above the water table. And carbon is also released to the atmosphere as methane, CH4, by microbes who do not need oxygen to function. And dissolved carbon is also lost to watercourses, where, as Flo described earlier, it gives the water that characteristic brown color. Much of this is then converted to CO2 and released back to the atmosphere. So if we tot up all the values from the individual carbon components of our peatland ecosystem, and I use here an example from a long-term study carried out in the Blanket Bog in Glencar, County Kerry, we can see that this site was a small carbon sink of around 0.38 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And when that value from County Kerry is compared to the long-term carbon dioxide sites across the boreal and temperate zones, circled here in red, we see that the values are remarkably similar. A small annual carbon sink, yes, but if we consider that this has played out for the past 10,000 years, we get some idea as to how we have come to possess such an incredible resource. Moreover, as you can be seen by the short error bars associated with each data point here, these mature and natural peatlands are also very resilient to short-term changes in weather patterns, in contrast to the wide variability shown in the abandoned and restored sites in this figure. Unfortunately, our story takes a little bit of a darker turn at this point, and as Flo has outlined already, Irish peatlands have been largely drained or degraded, with the main land use changes being the conversion to agriculture, which is mainly grassland, coniferous forest, and peat extraction. However, the fundamental impact of all these land use changes is drainage, either directly or indirectly, to enable the movement of machinery and livestock, or to facilitate the production of non-wetland plants such as coniferous trees or agricultural grasses. As the water table drops in response to drainage, it allows the flow of oxygen into the peat above the water table. This encourages the activity of oxygen-loving microbes who are able to decompose the peat 10,000 times faster than the oxygen-restricted microbes below the water table. Peat CO2 emissions increase dramatically, although they may be partially offset by the CO2 taken up by the grasses or the trees. In industrial peatlands, all the vegetation is removed prior to extraction, so in these sites, CO2 movement is in one-way traffic only. Drainage also increases the loading of dissolved carbon to the rivers, although methane emissions may drop substantially. At the national level, drainage of peatlands and organic soils accounts for a significant part of our national greenhouse gas emissions. Just to note that 1 ton of carbon is equivalent to around 3.67 tons of CO2. But grassland on drained organic soils is the largest emitter, releasing over 8 million tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. Peat extraction may release over 3 million tons of CO2, but we have a poor idea of how much of our peatlands have been affected by domestic turf cutting, and indeed this number could be higher or lower. Forest soils are interesting, as a recent paper from researchers in UL and UCD has demonstrated that CO2 emissions from these soils are much greater than previously thought, which casts doubt on whether our national forest stand on peat is a net carbon sink. So over the last few decades, the rewetting of formerly drained peatlands has been shown to be a viable option to shut down CO2 emissions and to place the peatland on a restoration trajectory. And to date, the majority of peatland rewetting projects in Ireland have occurred on former peat extraction sites. Studies both here and abroad have shown that when rewetting is successful, that is, when the water level is brought close to the surface of the soil and is maintained at that level throughout the year, then CO2 emissions can decrease substantially and very quickly. Here is some data from a Bord na Móna site at Moya Wood, County Galway. This raised bog was drained in the 1980s in preparation for peat extraction, which never happened, and the vegetation was left in situ. In 2012, the drains were blocked in much of the 190-hectare site, and we commenced a greenhouse gas study at the same time, measuring carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in drained areas on the margins and in a rewetted area further in. And as you can see from the graph, the water table in the drained areas of the site, indicated by the solid blue line, remained on average 50 centimeters below the peat surface for the 5 years of the study. In contrast, the water table in the rewetted areas, indicated by the dotted blue line, remained in or around the surface of the peat. So successful rewetting like this creates conditions that are needed for the return of peatland plants, such as sphagnum mosses, which may then lead to carbon sequestration. However, rewetting also leads to resumption of methane production, and most rewetting studies show that methane emissions can be considerable in the immediate years post-rewetting. Data from peat extraction sites that have been rewetted and monitored for carbon to date show that rewetting has a profound impact on the carbon balances in these sites. In this figure here, all the drain sites shown on the left are a carbon source, and indeed their emissions per year are very similar. In the absence of rewetting, these drained areas will continue to emit CO2 to the atmosphere until the peat is gone. And as I described at the start, will transfer the long-term carbon that is locked up in the peatland pool to the carbon pool in the atmosphere. Rewetting of these sites, though, resulted in a reduction in emissions, as in the case of the Blackwater Fen peat site, but with the bonus of carbon sequestration in the other 3 sites shown here. While rewetting will reduce CO2 emissions, the resumption of carbon sequestration is not preordained. In contrast to natural peatlands, which are remarkably similar in their annual carbon balance, rewetted peatlands are somewhat unpredictable, which is not surprising given that they differ widely in terms of their land use history, nutrient levels, and their plant and microbial communities. To date, the majority of peatland rewetting in Ireland has been undertaken by both Bord na Móna and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. The former has rewetted or rehabilitated some 10,000 hectares to date and has earmarked another 30,000 hectares for action in the next few years in their Peatlands Climate Action Scheme. The NPWS has rewetted or is in the process of rewetting 50,000 hectares of raised bogs. Under the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine Ag Climatized Roadmap, released in December 2020, at least 40,000 hectares of drained grassland on peat soils has been targeted for rewetting. Now, rewetting of these soils is interesting as it has not been widely implemented in this country to date, although it has been carried out in other jurisdictions such as Germany. In contrast to peat extraction sites where there is an emphasis on restoration to a functioning peatland ecosystem, with a desire to bring back characteristic peatland flora and fauna, rewetting of drained grassland sites offers the opportunity to solely target a reduction in carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. As I alluded to at the start of this talk, our peatlands and the carbon that they contain are also threatened by the projected impacts of climate change. And climate change projections indicate that we face considerable changes in temperature and precipitation over the next century. Work by Rowan Feely and colleagues at Maynooth University indicate that if we continue our current course of action in terms of overall emissions, also known as the business as usual approach, we can expect an increase in average air temperatures across all seasons and wetter winters and drier summers. Indeed, by the end of the century, they project that these changes will become even more severe, up to a 4-degree Celsius change in temperature. So what will these changes mean for our peatlands and their carbon? Well, the changes that our peatlands will experience in the next century will be unlike anything that they have experienced in their 10,000 years to date. As temperatures rise, evaporation and transpiration rates are likely to increase, removing moisture from the peat. This will lead to increased microbial activity as the water level drops and will lead to large losses of CO2 as the peat decomposes. In the second half of the century, the drier summer months combined with the increased temperatures will accentuate water level drawdown and will contribute to further losses of CO2. At the same time, however, methane emissions may decrease and new plant species such as trees and shrubs may begin to colonize the drier peat surface. Unfortunately, given our experience of dry weather conditions in this country, wildfires are extremely likely to become more common and could lead to widespread zombie fires when the peat itself catches fire and which can smolder for years, even during winter, as reported recently for Siberian peatlands. Indeed, there is evidence to indicate that natural peatlands have some resilience to short-term changes in rainfall. For example, sphagnum mosses are naturally able to retain considerable quantities of water and can buffer the effects of short drought periods. However, drained peatlands may be more vulnerable to climate changes. As an example, here is some temperature data from our 5-year Moya Woods study. It shows the hourly temperature at the drained in grey and rewetted sites in red. Fluctuations in soil temperature and the absolute temperature values are much greater in the drained site. It got much warmer in the summer and colder in the winter than the rewetted site, as the waterlogged conditions in the rewetted site were able to buffer the extremes of temperature. So clearly, we need to ensure that our peatland resource is in the best shape possible to deal with the projected impacts of climate change by acting today. So to summarize, while natural peatlands are a small carbon sink and a large carbon store, only a very small proportion of Irish peatlands are actively sequestering carbon. Current land use pressures have led to a situation where our peatlands are releasing substantial amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere and have increased the loading of dissolved carbon to our rivers and watercourses. If we are serious about tackling climate change in this country, we must stop this hemorrhaging of carbon to the atmosphere and to our watercourses. Rewetting offers a proven option to reduce emissions and can create conditions for the resumption of carbon sequestration at these sites again. So rewet to reduce carbon losses, restore to sequester carbon. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And if anybody has any questions, I'm available in the Q&A session later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. You've outlined the challenge with great clarity. I have to say, one of the slides that you showed, which showed permafrost sequestering to sometimes 3 times the amount of carbon to peatlands globally. And if you think about what's happening, climate change and to areas, the melting of permafrost and the release of carbon that's happening there, you get a very strong sense of the massive global challenge that's confronting this and future generations on that issue. So thank you again, David, for drawing our attention so eloquently to the potential of carbon management with our bogs. And that brings us to Derek McLoughlin, who is the third and final presenter this morning, who is basically has spent his career working on many aspects of the management of peatlands and associated habitats over the last 2 decades. Derek lives in Mayo and works with farmers and landowners across many projects, including the pearl mussel project under the European Innovation Partnership and also the EU RBPS project. So as Derek brings a great deal of application and experience to bear, and I look forward to hearing an account of the learnings from that. So I'll hand it to you, Derek.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, Minister. Thank you very much to the forum for the invitation here, and hello, everybody. I think they're really interesting presentations from David and Flo, We think of threats, we think of to peatlands, we think of drainage and agriculture and so on. And I suppose even looking at a higher level, what gives rise to those threats? And very often in the context of what I'm going to be talking about today, it's very much policy that is the originator of incentives and behavior on the ground in terms of farmer opportunities and so on. So I'm going to talk about results-based programs, particularly relating to peatland and my experience of those. By way of outline, we're looking at just what a general agri-environment program looks like, or what a well-designed one at least ought to look like. What are results-based payment schemes? How does it look on a peatland context? And how do we ensure the delivery of multiple services from these as well? Because we know the myriad of services that David and Flo described there, or the described part of those, but how can they be delivered in the context of multiple landowners across multiple areas within multiple different land use policies? So to give the broad context, what does a well-designed program look like? Now, this is in the context of agriculture I'm dealing with today, but it actually it's applicable to all types of programs. To run through these bullet points: locally adapted, practical and results focused. That means essentially not redoing it everywhere or redesigning it everywhere it works, but rather designing it with the targets in mind, with those that actually farm those areas. It needs to be properly and fairly funded, and building on the skills and experience of those that operate in those areas as well. And all the time bearing in mind the broader policy context of what may be the triggers behind activities, the type of farming activities, and that would ultimately give rise to or threats to peatlands. Facilitating flexibility and adaptive management on a farm within the management of a peatland is hugely important. We do things differently individually. Everybody attending here today, possibly even does their toast differently or butters their toast differently. And the idea of one rule for how to achieve a certain end can be quite damaging, can be constraining, and can limit the ambition to actually improve on the ground. Building trust and capacity is very important, obviously. Trust from the perspective of guidance and provision of advice, but also the capacity within, say, the farming community to deliver on potentially on actions of perhaps the rewetting or reactivating of peatlands, advisory capacity, and so on is a huge aspect there as well. One of the most important ones for me is to facilitate improvement. For the last almost 30 years or so, we've had agri-environment schemes that have been related to biodiversity, and we've spent quite a lot of money, several billion over the 30 years. Most of those have been, if not all of those, have been a one-size-fits-all prescriptive approach that says you do X, Y, and Z wherever you are at a certain time of year, and that's it. There is no facility to improve. You're almost a fool, in fact, if you're trying to do a better job, because there isn't the funding there. Everybody gets paid exactly the same, regardless of the output. And that acts as a disincentive as well in terms of improvements. And of course, from a farmer's perspective, accounting for factors outside the farmer's control themselves is something in the design of a program that needs to be considered. What are the key steps? Just to fly through these in terms of a well-designed program, one needs to obviously consider what are your targets, what are the legislative requirements, and how do they respond to agricultural practices. The design of these programs in the context of the results-based program, the design of scorecards, how do they reflect what Flo and David really want to see in terms of our climate ambition, and management guidelines to facilitate the improvements of these are very important as well. Obviously, fair costing and payment levels, how are they considered in terms of the flexibility of paying for different types of quality, and the provision of what's called non-productive investments, or what if a farmer wants to improve their ecological score and put in maybe block drains or whatever. Is that facility there? That needs to be there. The implementation needs to be straightforward and understandable to farmers. And of course, monitoring and evaluation needs to capture that. It needs to be an inherent capsule as such that feeds back into its evaluation. This will seldom be 100% the first day out, but the need to evolve with what we need to do to achieve our goals in terms of peatland management. In terms of the timeline of the results-based approach in an Irish context, we're very lucky to have a fantastic burn program that really, even in a European context, is very much the leading light in the development of these, where they simply, perhaps not so simply, but developed a very straightforward approach of the higher the scores of flower-rich meadows, the higher the payments the farmers received. And that was essentially the basis of these results-based programs that was developed through this EU RBPS program that was operational in the Midlands, and in Leitrim a couple of years ago through the really innovative European Innovation Partnerships funded by the Department of Agriculture that gave rise to the Hen Harrier project, the Pearl Mussel project, the REEKS project, and a lot of other really positive EIPs that have given us tools by which we can make very positive changes. Again, the results-based approach is very straightforward in its basic level. The higher the ecological quality on the ground, the higher the payment level. These are typically scored out of 10 on a field level. So the higher the ecological quality, the higher the farmer payments. And that then creates, has this effect of aligning the various policies, the nature policies, the water policies, the climate policies, the agriculture policies, that they start to pull in the same direction rather than pulling in different directions. To look at some of the detail of this, your typical scorecard here, this is from the Wild Atlantic Nature project in which I work. That very much takes from the Pearl Mussel project. I think is most of the scorecard comes from the Pearl Mussel project. Here there are 3 key aspects to the card, about 10 pretty simple questions in total. The first section is ecological integrity. What are the cover of positive indicators there? What are the cover of positive indicator species within this? What cover of invasives may be related there to that site? What's the extent of drains on the site, etc. And all of these are given a simple multiple choice answer, and a score accrues from those that ultimately is scored out of 10, but gives a related payment to that. Hugely important here, not just for the idea of scoring habitats out of 10, but also as a communication tool here as well. From a farmer's perspective, well, why did I only get a 6 out of 10? Well, the answer there is on the scorecard. Where did it fall in terms of the level of drainage of that peatland or the occurrence of rhododendron? Why did I get such a good score? Because it's a perfectly intact peatland, etc. So guidance is hugely important there as well. 2 simple cards, plant identification cards, and just simple bullet points as to how the scorecard works. So these scorecards, they really need to be usable by almost a 12-year-old that clearly define what one is looking for. Quality becomes the key, and from a management advice is very, very clear as to where it falls in terms of the actual scores. On the back of that card, I mean, the remainder of the 5 or 6 questions relate to ecological integrity, its input to water courses, and so on. So they capture in a very simple and straightforward way a hugely complex set of data, and they are, and possibly most importantly, the key communication tool for the farmer. That gives rise to this this evaluation and of condition and so on, and quality of your peatlands. But in a project like the Hen Harrier EIP, there they use this very similar peatland scorecard, but it's used as a surrogate for the quality of food sources for for the hen harrier. So even though it's hen harrier in name, it very much reflects the broader benefits of that the peatlands are delivering. And of course, in this case, they have extra bonuses for successful fledgling of hen harrier chicks and so on. In the context of water quality, the Pearl Mussel project is a very good example here as well. And when one is looking at peatlands, it's very important not just to look at peatlands, but the associated habitats, the supporting habitats, the green land that may be used from a stock perspective to manage the peatlands. And here, it's so necessary to consider the whole farm approach here as well. In the context of results-based programs where one is looking at water quality, you need to capture the lowest and the worst performing aspect of the farm, as well as incentivizing and rewarding the best. So the whole farm approach is absolutely essential. And here is the whole farm approach that we're using on the Wild Atlantic Nature Life integrated project as part of that, and has been developed in the Pearl Mussel project. On the right hand side is the key aspect here: simple correction factors where a results-based payment accrues within a whole farm, within a farm. It's added up, it comes to, I don't know, €5,000 or whatever. And then there's this correction factor from poor, inadequate, good, or excellent. And depending on the overall performance of that farm will determine where that falls there. So that's a very, very strong incentive. If there's a major issue, water quality issue or whatever that might be, that farm might come in at inadequate, which is a whole farm correction factor of 0.6 or even poor. But of course, there's that headroom to for those that are delivering excellent quality throughout their farm of that whole farm score of excellent. And again, it's the importance of the integration of where peatlands stand not just by themselves, because they don't occur just by themselves. There's activities that go on along with them within the farm and so on. So we can't just have a peatlands approach. It has to be this whole farm approach as a support for these peatlands. So in a nutshell here, the simple payment streams for farmers in results-based programs are this results-based payment multiplied by the whole farm score, which is essentially characterize the condition of that farm. And then there's this other little capsule that are the supporting actions. And this is to facilitate improvements here as well. So just back to the various different rewetting measures or removal of invasives or whatever it might be. This is where the funding stream that this would come. So if a farmer is performing or has a lower score, a lower payment, they are facilitated to improve via these supporting actions, which are separately funded. On the ground, your typical farm will have a whole range of different scores. They'll have issues here, perhaps some farms may have, but of course, from a supporting actions perspective, they're very clear and well specified to facilitate their improvement there as well. Just coming to the end here now, but the key aspect here is the investment in the skills and of the landowner and of communities. If you have two farmers side by side, one which understands the functioning of their peatlands, one the neighbour that doesn't, the outcome is going to be a lot better, and those that do understand these. So that's where the communication tool, the support and advice is just hugely important. And as a second to last slide, just on Wild Atlantic Nature project itself, it's an EU Life integrated project under Minister Noonan's department here. And it's a 20 million funded project across 9 years that looks at almost 250,000 hectares of blanket bogs and associated habitats throughout the Northwest. We're delighted to have 9 associated beneficiaries along with us on this. So the real aim, I suppose, here is the integration of the various different land use frameworks. The idea of our peatlands as it sits into the broader CAP policy, the interdepartmental cohesion and collaboration is just hugely important here as well. But the overall program, the overall ethos of these results-based approaches is that we focus on quality, and that's what the aim is, to achieve those 10s out of 10s or the higher scores, the 7 out of 10 pluses. And we build from nothing, adding the scores as we go. So it does need to invest in landowner skills, and that's what the results-based models very much do. And then just as a final, I suppose, sign off in the Wild Atlantic Nature Project, we were building on the successes of the likes of some of the EIPs, and being an integrated project as well, we have the facility to attract further funding. That could be capped funding, it could be further life funding and whatever. So it's a very exciting opportunity to be able to collaborate for those of you out there that have projects that may benefit from being part of our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Derek. A hugely informative presentation. I'm very struck by the approach being adopted to results-based payments, and I guess the reliance in particular on farmers becoming to be reacquainted with their landscape, the requirement that they learn material that maybe over generations farming has forgotten. I often wonder, for instance, what level of knowledge will a farmer walking through his or her field have of the various grass types and wildflowers that are actually growing in their field. So it's supremely interesting, the approaches you've just alerted us to in terms of building knowledge apart altogether from building a different approach to land management in the context of environmental needs. There are multiple questions have come in for the panel, and I really want to thank the three presenters for the level of mental and intellectual stimulation that you've just managed to ferment here. But I think there are two very dominant questions emerging. One, I guess, relates partly to what Derek has just covered. I think people are asking the question: if you re-wet to a water table of between 0 and 30 centimeters, what kind of farming things can you do on that landscape? What kind of crops can you produce, or animals would be able to provide I guess a commercial income for farmers in that situation? Florence, I think the question was asked primarily of you, but I'm sure other panelists, and I guess in particular Derek, might have a view on that. So I'll hand it to you first, Florence, if that's okay.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, there is. So again, I want to really emphasize the fact that the water table between 0 and 30 centimeters is important, but the type of peat that you have will also very much be important. Okay, that really is the key thing. Learn what peat type you have, because if you have that nutrient-rich peat, the fen peat in the Midlands that has been, the top has been already gone and burned or whatever, and you are growing grass on that. This is our hotspots of CO2 at the moment, emissions. So you really want to bring up the water table as much as possible, so you can still have your cattle or your sheep on your grass, but really try to bring that water table up. And this is quite feasible in the Midlands because of the landscape. In the west of Ireland, the blanket bogs, this is quite different. The water table could be much more at different levels, and you can see how, and Derek will explain how you can have multiple different types of management there. But to go back to the ones which are relatively easy to manage the water table at a field scale, you can then also go into what we call biodiversity, which is growing plants and crops. Now, remember, we have very few crops on organic soils. It's mostly grassland. Okay, so it's mostly grassland. But if some farmers are interested in biodiversity, which is growing certain types of plants on reeds, for example, on wet soils. This is happening in Germany, and Greifswald University are really leading this, and big landscapes now have been transformed so that farmers can make an income in using this new rewetted peatlands with a crop that can be either burned into local power station or for other purposes. So I leave Derek to answer the other question, maybe from the blanket bog perspective and how to manage the water table there.
Thanks, Florence. Derek, can we go back to you on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose our experience in the West in the blanket bog context is that at first, when we were discussing rewetting, or as I often describe it, them kind of reactivating the peatlands, because you're just rebreathing life into a lot of them as well. The initial fear was that we're going to have a huge lake, or that some of these catchments will just become permanently flooded, won't be eligible for single farm payments, and a lot of fears like that. When farmers would have gone through the scorecard, we may have seen that they're losing 2 or 3 points or whatever it might be because of drains. They may have associated lots of points because of bare peat. Those that have gone to look at drain blocking and rewetting or reactivating the peatlands have been hugely surprised by elevating the water levels in the drains, getting a greater cover of the vegetation on the peats, and that they're not up to their necks or up to their oxters in very, very wet peats as such. It's absolutely grazable from a stock perspective, and it works very well. And the farmers of maybe 40 or 50 farmers that I know that have these measures in place to assist them in increasing their score, and then their score is permanently higher, so their annual income is higher as a result of that. Understand and have no fear whatsoever of this idea of their land flooding. And on the contrary, in fact, a lot of them have a huge surprise of the amount of silt that has suddenly built up around these blocking measures, where natural flush areas have kind of reactivated, and the system is more natural, is less prone to drying out, and is less prone to erosion as well, because the peats are a lot more stable in these contexts as well. So I would say those that we've worked with in terms of rewetting and restoring, particularly in the likes of the Pearl Mussel project and the Hen Harrier project, have been very, very pleased with the results.
Thanks very much, Derek and Flo. I suppose just said it's not to be unexpected that people are interested in this webinar on any quick wins for water quality from rewetting of peatlands. And I guess in the third cycle river-based management plan is about to be produced by the department in draft form, going out to a 6-month consultation, and then due for publication next year. Would the panel have a view as to how you would expect to see rewetting or used as a vehicle, as part of our approach to managing water quality in rivers? Is there something here we should be pursuing?
If I come in on that just briefly, the answer is yes, and that's as I was saying in my talk, water is key, really. This is the life of the bog. So interestingly enough, we have been working with peatlands in Ireland for over 20 years, and it's we've always addressed it mostly from a land use, and I think the water is becoming quite key here, because peatlands now currently feature in some of the world's highest level environmental policies. Okay, in recognition that they should not only be protected but rewetted for mainly water, because okay, we live in Ireland, but in the rest of the world, actually the peatlands are really, that's what they are, their source of water, and water is becoming scarce. So, water is something that people have to, can relate to. We want clean water. We want water, and the brown water coming out of degraded bogs is a serious financial and health concern. So, of course, I
I would hope that having a fifth of the country under peatlands, Ireland, when it looks at its water policies, it has to include peatlands as a priority.
Thanks, Florence. I'm just a little bit concerned about our time, but I do want to ask David a question, and then we'll move to the break. I know people are asking about access to your presentations. Just to let you all the attendees know that we will all receive an email with the link to the website of Forumishka, and all the presentations will be available to you there. But the question, David, I wanted to ask you was the issue of carbon farming. You know, in Ireland we produce, as you know, we produce cattle, we produce milk, we produce some cereals and vegetables in the usual food products. Do you see any possibility where actually farmers would be simply go into a different product, which is sequestering carbon? That's what they do.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Tom, and I would love to see it. And I think there has been soundings coming from EU. I think Frans Timmermans is pushing this very strongly, that carbon farming becomes something that we all become very familiar with. That farmers are paid for the carbon that they store. So any farmer that has farm on peatlands, would certainly be of benefit there because of the amount of carbon that's locked up in those soils. But there is a range of soils as well that, as we move from the pure peat to the mineral soil, there's a range of carbon contents in a lot of soils. So even if they're not strictly peatlands, they're certainly organic soils and would have a very high carbon content, which should be taken into consideration. That's the store. To encourage farmers to develop climate-friendly practices, then we really should be then rewarding them to develop practices like rewetting, where we can encourage firstly we maintain the carbon that they have in the soil, and then we can encourage this rebooting of the system, that we start to bring in carbon again. I certainly would like to see it. I don't think it's totally impossible, but I think we have a good bit of ground to go before it becomes tangible from the point of view of actually quantifying fields at one field from another, how much carbon is in each. It's going to need a lot of data to underpin this new policy. If we can get that data in place and have very robust data that we can be confident in, then I would very much like to see this. I think it'll be a logical win-win for everyone. The farmers would get recognized for looking after and being in ownership of stewardship of this land, this carbon, and we also have the possibility that we are doing a very active climate mitigation action with it. So, yeah, fingers crossed, I guess.
Thanks, David.
Tom, can I say something very quickly there?
Yeah.
I think there are very exciting opportunities. I think it's important to bear in mind, of course, as well as David and Flo have pointed out, that there's a serious leak in the bucket, and we've a long way to go to get to the point where we're not losing carbon, because you often find that where exciting new industries come along, quick adopters will go to those and do well out of those, whilst we're still losing, where policy gives rise to losses of carbon across 70% of our peatlands in the west of Ireland, or wherever it might be. So I think from aligning our policies are hugely important, and I think from the results-based approach, where you've got that fully integrated approach there, perhaps your scorecard approach with your biodiversity, your carbon and your water being captured in those, I think would be really important first port of call.
Thanks, Derek. And that allows me to mention the forum's approach to water management, which is very, very strongly promoting the concept that we refer to it as FILM, which is a framework for integrated land and landscape management. And we talk about the co-benefits around water, biodiversity, soil and air. And this is, I think, what the results-based work is actually looking at, probably all of those issues. So I'm going to have to bring this session to a close by thanking our three presenters. I think you've given us an enormous amount of information and inspiration, with some very challenging tasks also presented in front of us. There is one question on the Q&A which I'm not able to get to now, which is what proportion of our peatlands can actually be recovered. I know Florence said 18% are conservation value. Is there a very quick answer to that question, Florence, just in terms of getting a sense of what
there isn't for the bogs. There is, for the rice bogs, those 50,000 hectares and PWS aim to rewet. They have to be rewet. We can't go back. That's our last rice bogs. So, you know, there's no that's the 50,000 hectares. And overall, I think there's just a little. All our network are protected networks. That's the ones we need to focus on, obviously. But that's a small proportion, you know, obviously 18%. So the rest, I think that the blanket bogs are going to be our best resource to kind of do it, because there's large landscape there. We can really work efficiently over large landscape, and that's going to be very important. So no, there's no quick answer for the non-designated sites, unfortunately.
Thanks, Florence. All we know is there's a lot to be done, and yes. Again, deepest thanks to the three presenters. Just to remind the attendees, there's a poll question there, which you're being asked to agree with the following statement, or state whether you agree, disagree, or unsure, that you're optimistic that measures can be put in place to prevent further harm to peatlands. So are you optimistic that measures can be put in place to prevent further harm to peatlands? That poll is now open, and it will be open until the end of the next session. The next session will deal with the social and cultural dimension of peatlands, and I think it will be really worth rejoining us. So let's take 5 or 10 minutes break, and we will resume at 11:30, and that'll actually get us back into time. But in the meantime, deepest thanks to all the panelists and to the Minister for the first session. Thank you, and we'll see you back at 11:30.